known artist. He had more one-man shows at the Chicago Art Institute than any other artist.
I know who Albright is now, okay.
And he's the father of two famous artists, twins.
And do you have a project in the wings waiting, or is that one pretty much taken up all your energy?
Well, I'm also working on an article on stagecoach routes in DuPage County. Not a book, just an article. I love maps, by the way. I make them.
Very good. Okay, I think that'll do it.
Good evening. Today is Wednesday, August 25th, 1999. We are gathered together under the auspices of the Warrenville Historical Society to interview three longtime residents of Warrenville who were gracious enough to share some of their thoughts with us here this evening. We're going to ask that they search their memories for some of the earlier days of Warrenville. And, my name is Bob Walters. I'm with the Historical Society. To my right is Joe Heller of Town Line Road. To my immediate left is Harold Bolwig of Main Street. And to my far left, Joe Kleinwachter of River Road. I'm going to start with Joe Heller and ask Joe if you'd please tell us where you were born and what year your family moved to Warrenville and where you lived in those early days.
I was born in rural Glenelg on a farm, Park Boulevard area. The family moved to Warrenville when I was 6 months old, so that was about 1909 when we moved here. And
Did they say it ought 9 in those days, or?
I was too young to remember that. No, well, that's when we moved here. I started school at Sarah Warren Homes in 1914. And was a little disappointed when they tore it down in 1900s because I could still see it out my front window, and there aren't too many people that could look out the window and see where they started school 85 years ago. So,
what house was that?
where I live now, the curve on Curtis, I could see the school up there until they tore it down.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, that was one of the points of my family I could bring them to discuss it with them. It was quite a, well, we lived on the farm on River Road until 1927. And that's when we moved to Wheaton.
Okay.
Went to school in Warrenville and Wheaton, and that was it. Always in this area.
Very good. Harold, I'd have the same question for you. What year did your family move to Warrenville, and where did you live in those early days?
Yeah, my folks moved to Warrenville in 1926. And before that, we lived on a farm, part of right the area where the Wheaton Warrenville High School is now. Because the first farm west of that was the old Bolwig estate. Weesbrook farm was the one right where the heart of the Wheaton Warrenville High School is. And before that, well, I was born in Wheaton. We moved out on the farm when I was about 4 years old, and I was on there for about 7 years.
Okay. Joe, would you mind asking or answering the same questions?
We left Germany in 23. We went to my dad's sisters. You had to have, those days you had to have a sponsor, you had to have somebody to take care of you, a job and so on. He had two sisters in Chicago. One was an iceman and the other was a bakery. And we came over in 23. He had fought with Wilhelm in 1918. And so at 23 we moved over here. We went into Chicago for about 6 months, and he couldn't stand working in a factory. He's a blacksmith. And he was on one of the interviews, they won a horseshoe out at the Arlington racetrack. So he went out there and he worked there for a while, and all this time he's reading the German paper called Abendpost, and he saw the guy, Lema Krauss, died in Warrenville, and the business was for sale. So he came over here to Warrenville, and this is in about 24. We actually moved in here in 25, and he bought that blacksmith shop, and it was part of the bare garage, really, about where the parking lot is in the back. It was an orange building, about the same size it was. And while he was there, and we first moved into a house up on Jackson. That was between, a little street between Albright Studio and Winfield Road. We had a fire there, and the house, it caught a fire, and all the people in town come up there and put the fire out, and we all moved out of there. I slept at the Stanfords, and Herbie went over to the Lunds, and the other ones at other places, and through the night Dad stayed there, and the house caught a fire again. It was probably in the wall or something. And I think shortly after that, when they got together, now the Warrenville Fire Departments are getting active, and they said, we need a fire department here in town. Anyway, we moved from there over to Roar Road, where Baker lives now, on Stedman and Roar Road. We lived there for a number of years. Then we moved back over to 2nd Street to a little house there with a big glass front of it and one thing and another. And then he bought the property where we are now. The blacksmith shop was part of it. He moved over there, and we had made 3 or 4 lots out of this thing. And to get a building of his own, he measured this building next door. And he built a building. And believe me, this man knew nothing about building anything. And the house that we lived in all those years, we dug the sand out of the basement, and we made cement blocks out of it. It was that pure and clean. It was sand and pea gravel and stuff. We made cement blocks, and he built the building out of that thing. So all these years, until we all separated up there, we lived there since 25 through, well, until I went to the service, and about practically 15 years later. And we lived right across the street from the Baldwigs. They lived in a house on Winfield Road in Jackson, and I used to go over to their house at 6 o'clock in the morning, Mrs. Baldwig, and Buck was there, and we'd go over there, and she'd feed me, and we'd sit there and we'd chin and chat for quite a while there. So I was pretty well familiar with the Baldwig family long before they moved over to 1st Street, or whatever we call it, on
Tavy Road.
Tavy Road. So that's, I'm talking about many early years now. We're talking about, I can remember the first church we had up on Roar, those days was Roar Road, Kolodziejski's that we lived there later on. Remember that they had a stove in the front of the building, and of course that time we were part of Naperville Diocese, and we were a outlandish church, what do they call it? A
Missionary church.
Missionary church, okay. And I remember that very well, and went to church there until we built a new one. So.
That was the old Legion Hall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before that, that's
right.
It was Legion Hall.
Yeah.
Well, did each of you gentlemen find that Warrenville, when you came to this community, was kind of a friendly town, the type of place where you...
Well, the first thing I know, when I grew up here, there wasn't much of a town. I can relate to almost all the houses because our path was always, this is the back end of the farm I was brought up on. And all our interests and relatives were in Wheaton, so we headed for the Royals. And for many years, and the path was to Pettit's store, past the Baptist church. There was between the Baptist church and Fairbanks, there was a little path. We used to dodge around there, and then up the corner around Tut's house and Perry Rice's, and then there were 2 houses where Earl Stafford lived eventually. I mean, Duffy and somebody else were there before. And then there were the schoolhouse and the 2 houses, the one that Stresney has, and the there was another, there were two houses, Bertrand's were in one,
Lloyd
And-
lived in the other.
and Charlie Lloyd, yeah.
Charlie Lloyd, yeah.
And
Of course, you're talking about what we-
this is way ahead of Charlie Lloyd.
Oh, yeah,
If you
well,
want to really go back, everything was a path and a shortcut across any lot or anywhere. Well, where the Baptist church is there now, that was the first cut off. Perry Rice's cut off, and eventually someone got on, and well, that was probably about the time Glen Mount came out here. They got cinder sidewalks.
Cinder sidewalks, absolutely.
Got the cinders from the old generating station in Batavia, and all my folks, I know George, and worked for days with a team of horses in a box wagon shoveling out the cinders. And they did help, but they were the darndest things in your shoes. Oh, God.
Maybe a little sharp.
You never got to the depot without having a bunch of cinders in your shoes.
But Joe, those homes you mentioned were on Warren Avenue, right?
Yeah.
You're talking
Yes,
about
yes,
Stafford and Duffy and...
Four houses, there were 4 houses on Warren.
Yeah, I can recall a few things that happened in 1926 when we moved into town. First of all, the concrete pavement was just being put in there.
Yeah.
And they had the old iron bridge was torn down, and they had the concrete bridge across there, but they didn't have the road extended east of it. So that spring, with all the thawing of the snow and everything else, and the water run down the hill, everything would back up there right short of the bridge there. In the meantime, these old Model Ts that's all there was, I believe, at that time, they would go off this bridge and sink practically out of sight. And Frank Rogers had a team of old gray horses. He lived right in that corner of the first house on the east side of the river, on the south side of Warrenville, Belmont Road, as it's called now. And he would be towing them all out of there. That's the thing. And of course, shortly after that, the Baptist church burned down. And you were talking about the founding of the fire department by Father Hanneschmacher, who was the first pastor of St. Irene's, come up with the initial move to formulate the fire department. Within 6 weeks, there was 4 very well-constructed homes that were burned down. And the McDonald twins, the girls,
Right.
had that one home there, and that was a nice brick home. And that burned out. All they had is the bucket brigade, and the bucket brigade didn't amount to too much. So that was the start of the fire department, and shortly thereafter.
That concrete road you made reference to, was that Batavia Road? Was that the first paved road?
First paved road, yes.
And then the iron bridge was the bridge
Right, going across the
by
DuPage
the
River
town
there.
tap?
Yeah,
Well,
right there east of Pettit's.
While that bridge was out, we used to go up to, Main Street, right?
yeah,
Drive
to the
through the
shallow
river. Might have had to wait for somebody what was washing their car in the
Oh, yeah.
river to get through, but that was the car wash.
That was a car wash.
Driving forward into
Free car wash.
Huh?
Free car wash.
Well, one of the questions I really wanted to talk to you about, and I'm glad you've certainly touched on it, is what the roads were like in the earlier days. Now, I always puzzle about Butterfield Road. Was that the main highway that it is today, or was that just another small road coming through town?
Butterfield Road was not extended through Warrenville back in those days. That was State Road, they called it, but you had to jog around up the hill and go north. And then when you got by Brooks McCormick's property, or St. James Farm, then it went east over another iron bridge over the CA&E Railroad.
Right.
But it was not continued through there. Oh no.
All we had
Years
was,
later.
actually, it was almost farm to farm is what it was. River Road was, people down here were Kearns's, and Phil Les lived on there.
Sure.
And then,
And the bear farm
And then
on top of the hill. The bear farm on
Bears
top
run
of
it,
the
yeah.
hill. Yeah.
So the farms were quite a part of Warrenville life in those days.
it was all.
Farmed right close in. I have an interesting thought to comment on. When my dad found his business in Warrenville, there were so many people, like Joe referred to, in town. All the numbers were included on one page.
Yeah.
And my dad's big telephone number was 34.
3-4.
Well,
And of course, we had the central operator, Marion Glass, on that thing. And
Red-headed Glass.
when you'd call in there by she'd be asking for somebody, going, Doyle, no, she's over at so-and-so's house. So we didn't have too much private.
No, there's number.
She was a hub of Warrenville, wasn't she?
She was.
One knows something, call Mary and she'll tell you.
That's right, she took care
Tell
of
you where he is tonight, what she's doing
informing
tonight.
everybody.
Yeah.
She not only knew they weren't home, but she could also tell
Oh,
you where they're
Who
at.
they were with.
Yeah, that's neat. What are some of your memories about the Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin Railroad?
Well, I was probably the first one that went to school out of here on the Roaring Elgin. And there were there was good transportation as far as, in the earlier days, it was a little slower. We used to buy school ticket books, let's see, 42 rides, I think, for $2.76. Anyway, it was 6 cents a ride. And that went on for most of the years until we got into high school. I mean, the price was about the same. It was 6 cents a ride. And then you got a card with the numbers on it, and they punch them off. But it was odd. You'd go up that station, and it was separated because they had the rotaries over in the west section. And of course, I didn't know what a rotary was or anything else. Didn't have any idea, but you'd hear when the train would come into the section, the things would start clicking and bing, 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 and breakers close, and the machine would be on the line. So, and oddly enough, I wound up in those places with a public service company.
Well, the odd thing is, as I know it now, you paid $2.76 for a ticket. It finds out later on, of course, I'm off the railroad now, I'm older. The school board is supposed to be paying for this.
What?
The school board is supposed to be paying for our transportation, like they do now.
Oh, well, there wasn't any such thing.
No.
Well, here,
They didn't do it.
nobody enforced it. But shortly after I got off this whole thing, the school board picked up all the free thing. Anyway, while the thing was going on now, I'm talking about in the early, had to be 33, 34. I first went to Aurora on the Aurora and Elgin, but I worked the ticket office. I opened and closed at 6. I opened at 6 o'clock in the morning for Mrs. Gilbert, who owned the concession.
Who was in
Mrs.
charge?
Gilbert.
Connie,
Connie Connard, and she was there.
She
right?
was there before
Well,
that.
she was there before me, but when I got to work there with
Oh.
Mrs. Gilbert, I worked for her, and I would stay on the thing, and I would, to 722, I get on a train, I'd go to Aurora, to Illinois Avenue, to Marmion. I guess you were up there before that.
Well, yes, I went there 8 years over at St. Michael's, 7 years over there. 1 year, Paul Bear promoted a bus, and he took the Catholic children over to St. Peter and Paul's.
I was there.
Oh, yeah.
And that was when I was in
That was my
7th
first
grade.
year.
Then I went to 4 years Fox Valley.
Did you?
Yeah, it was Fox Valley them days, yes. That was
Yeah.
before it turned to a military school.
Yeah, I was there at the military school.
Yeah.
And but I worked at the station before that and come home, you know, then I went out I wound up in Wheaton High School and graduated in 39, which is a year way later than what you were there. But the Ron Nelson was a mainstay. I mean,
Oh,
the best damn
absolutely.
thing they ever had in Warrenville, but
Absolutely.
until these guys bought the darn thing. I can remember Red Fairbanks,
Switzerland.
who was my father-in-law.
Sure.
He came home, it must have been 58 or 59 or something. He came in and he said, they're going to close the railroad. Oh, no. He said, this thing is going great. I wasn't using it at that time anymore. He said, yeah, he said, they can't do it. Well, that word, you can't do it. You know, it's like everything else. A bunch of Kansas, I heard a bunch of Kansas farmers bought the thing, sold it for scrap, and
Yeah.
made out handsomely on the thing. So. And now they could use it the worst way again, of course. But
Much of what Warrenville is and has been is because of gentlemen like yourself that have over the years given so willingly of yourself. And just being here tonight is kind of indicative of that to me. And we, with the Warrenville Historical Society, certainly appreciate you taking this time because your memories will be with us forever. And that's great. That's wonderful. we'll make sure that this tape is preserved, and future generations, when they want to know about Warrenville and the good old days, will have the opportunity to come to the museum and see it. Would you care to make any comments as we wind this down?
Well, really, even my own family, they get me to tape this stuff. We're here at present, we can still talk about it, but we're getting fewer and fewer and fewer. And to go back all these years, nobody remembers this unless you talk to people there. And unfortunately, you think about this a year or two after the guy dies, which all this memory that you've had,
It's gone.
you know, it's gone. I mean, there's no way of ever getting it back. I had no knowledge that your age and you started here in town. I remember they had a farm down there, the Grumless farm and the dairy they had down there, but later on, and it's all the same. That I helped sell half of this subdivision here.
Well, that's
With
right.
mounts.
With mounts, yeah, that's right, as a realtor.
Yeah, $500 a lot,
Yeah.
$10 down and no interest.
What are they going toward now, about 90,000?
Well, whatever you can get for it. It's a
Traffic
limit.
there.
Whatever the traffic will bear.
Yeah.
Well,
What
like
I
I
was-
say, we really do appreciate not only your time, but we appreciate you
Here's your next-
of what you've done.
Good morning. Today is Saturday, November 22nd, 2003. My name is David Anderson from the Warrenville Historical Society. We are here today in the home of Dwight and Vivian Lund to interview Dwight as well as Jack Player about their growing up in Warrenville and particularly about their family's businesses here to learn more about how that was in earlier times. So, good morning. Thank you for being with us.
Good morning.
If you'd introduce yourselves and begin to tell us a little bit about you, your family, and then we'll move on to your businesses.
I'm Jack Player, legally known as John M. Player Jr. The family moved to Warrenville in 1930. My father and his brother Robert Player started their dairy business here in the 1928-29 era. They had their first dairy set up or built on Winfield Road behind what is now the stone block or cement block house and known as what was formerly the Player residence. And I have 3 sisters and 1 brother, all younger than I do. My mother passed away in 1942. My dad remarried, and I also have a half-brother and a half-sister who are also players.
And Dwight?
Well, my family bought the property in 1918, and they moved here in 1921. My dad was a greenhouse man. That was his career. And he wanted a business of his own, so he built the greenhouses particularly higher than most local greenhouses, particularly at the base of the V, because he wanted to grow sweet peas. And in the 20s, sweet peas were the flower of society. No one went anywhere without a corsage of sweet peas or this type of thing. And he was selling wholesale. He built a wholesale greenhouse. He was selling sweet peas at $5 and 6 cents a stem. So this was a very rewarding business. It was a hard business because sweet peas are vines and they have to grow up. And so he had to install, every time he changed the crop, he had to strings between wires 5 and 6 feet tall so that the vines could grow. And he would have that whole greenhouse with these rows of strings and sweet peas. It was productive enough so that he would have a summer crop outdoors in back of the greenhouse, and it got so extra productive that he rented space across the road from Hugo Kleinwachter, who lived on Jefferson Street, and the whole place was surrounded with sweet peas and these same strings and all that hard work of putting them up. And I know when I was a youngster, they would bunch these sweet peas in the packing shed, which was there at the time, and it was literally a wholesale operation, so there was no refinement. But They would bunch them, 25 sweet pea stems in a bunch, in a flat fan-shaped bunch, and they had so many sweet peas that the perfume literally filled that shed and spilled out outdoors during the summer. So it was a fabulous, and sweet peas are no longer a viable commercial product. And so whenever I see them, I go kind of bananas over them. And we had that to occur to us when Jenny and I were in Sweden in 1998, and there was a flower shop that had sweet peas. I couldn't pass them up. I bought them for our hostess, and they had long stems like this, which was also unusual. So that was what started us in Warrenville. And I had one sister. She died in August of this year, Mary, and we were raised in that operation. They bought the house. The house was on the same property where the greenhouse was. And my dad built those greenhouses by himself. He had help, but he had bought the first greenhouses, which were adjacent to the packing shed, used. They were 35 years old when he bought them. And they were made out of swamp cypress, the wood bars that held the glass, and they last forever. So he had help from the Kalin brothers, who had a greenhouse operation in West Chicago, where right across the street from Ball Seed Company and General Mills. So this was sort of a fraternity of greenhouse growers, and there were quite a few greenhouses in this west metropolitan area. It was farmland then, and he had to ship his flowers into Chicago to the wholesale florists, who then paid him. It was all on consignment, and he would get a commission, and if they sold, he got his commission. If they didn't sell, they got dumped, nothing. But wholesale florists in Chicago shipped all over the United States, and basically through the Midwest, as far down as New Orleans and as far west as Iowa and east to Indiana. These flowers went everywhere. Then he would pack them in a shipping box about the size of this coffee table, and about that deep, and he would have to take them over to Winfield to be put on Railway Express to go into Chicago and then be delivered from the express station to the wholesale florist. So he would have to get up very early in the morning, work all day, pack these things in the evening, and then get up very early in the morning and drive them to Winfield to make Railway Express. Later there was a company in Batavia that operated a motor express, and they would come around and pick them up in the morning, so that wasn't quite as bad, but that was into the late 30s when that occurred. So he had a pickup truck, and that was all we had, was a pickup truck. But that's what he got around with. So the railroad wasn't the safest place, but the railroad was mass transportation was fabulous, because you could get on the train in Warrenville and you could be downtown in the Loop in an hour. Well, you can't do that very well on the expressways now, the rush hour.
One of the other businesses was the Roundhouse.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that was probably the predecessor even of McDonald's for drive-up service, because I can remember that my dad would swing around there, and here was this round block building, and Matt, I can't think of what the gentleman's name was. Yeah, we're both having trouble with that anyway. He sold the Chicago papers that would come in on the Roaring Elgin in the morning, and he'd take the papers in there, and then when the customers would just drive up, and they'd drive with the left-hand side right by the window on the side of this roundhouse building, and he'd hand them the paper, and he'd pay him the money, and away you go. Because I can remember many days my dad would pick up at the Chicago Trib at that spot and chat with Matt, and I always liked to go along because he also sold candy bars, so that was always good for a Milky Way.
Was there another business beyond the
Yes.
sleep store back in there?
Yes,
Yeah.
there was a lumber yard, a coal yard, Moore's lumber yard, and the Hall of History in City Hall. That picture that is taken, that looks like an aerial view I think if you look at one of those pictures, there was a water tower or a grain elevator. And then somebody took the picture east from the top of that, so that you got the aerial view of Warrenville. And that one is very, there's a lot of detail in that shows up that you wouldn't normally see. I can go down like pointing out all kinds of things on that picture because it was so unique.
Any other businesses that you remember then?
Later, the lumberyard, after they went out of business, they had a restaurant in the building. That must have been back in the 50s or 60s.
Yeah, Nook and Cranny.
Which,
The Nook and Cranny.
yeah, Nook and Cranny, right. Then, those are the only businesses I remember.
Yeah, I don't recall
From
any.
your childhood, I think that's what we wanted to get at.
Yeah.
If we come back along Warren Avenue down to Warrenville Road, turn left, the one other business I remember a little bit would be the Pony Barn.
Oh, Pony Barn Press?
Yes.
That was Edward M. Strutt Moore's building, which I guess it was technically a business. And my dad and he were very good friends. And my dad would spend a lot of time with Strutt Moore, and he was also one of the dairy customers. I remember I would deliver, he was part of my milk route, so I'd deliver a pint of regular milk, pasteurized milk, but it wasn't homogenized back in those days. And I'd deliver a pint of milk every day. And of course, one of the features of Strutt was he was one of the few people that could whistle to call his dog, and he'd walk uptown to get his mail every day and pick up his mail and walk back home. And he printed all the billing statements for Player Dairy. My dad would give him the contract, such as it was, with a shake of the hand. And so whenever the statements were issued, they were always on billing statements, little half-sheet statements that were printed by the Pony Barn Press. And Strutt Moore, then there was a...
He got his name because of the way he walked.
Yeah.
He was very, very erect. He strutted when he walked. So the kids named him Strut.
Ian Moore.
And if you find your way back then, you were mentioning the blacksmith shop.
Oh, we
Yeah.
could climb walker in the blacksmith shop. And Jack could probably tell more about it because again, I didn't get around like Jack did with the dairy things. And his dad could talk the leg off of you. He was very social. And like he says, I think his dad probably didn't work as hard as it seemed because he was always visiting with people. And very knowledgeable about history.
Yeah.
That's another whole story.
That's a good, he was a great historian.
Tell about her.
Hugo.
Hugo.
About the blacksmith.
And Hugo ran this blacksmith, had originally it was a hand-powered bellows to operate the forge, and then by the time it got to the mid-30s, then it was electric-powered, and he had electric-powered forge. And this was before welding really came into being. And then when Herbie, I think was the son that went in and worked with him, Herbie had learned how to operate a DC welder. And they did welding at that, but before that, the welding was done by heating two ends of a piece of steel and bringing them out and pounding on the anvil and literally forging the metal together to weld two pieces of steel together. And that was one of the repairs that they used on my bicycle. My bicycle, the seat stem was too short for the bicycle that I had at that time, and I asked them if they could weld another piece on, and they said sure, and that was how they did it. Because they just stuck both pieces in the forge and red hot, welded them together and ground them down so they'd fit in the bicycle. But they also shoed horses there. A lot of the farmers would bring their teams to town and have the horses shod, and did just all kinds of general repair. It was a great place to stop and visit and catch up on all the local gossip, and watch Hugo, who had just huge arms. He was such a powerful man from swinging these heavy mauls. He had a 3-pound maul that you and I would handle like a 12-ounce hammer today, and it was just amazing. And then his English was very broken. You could barely understand his German dialect.
Well, they lived on Jefferson over here, just across from the greenhouse where my folks lived. And the house caught on fire, and they managed to get the fire out, and the kids were all farmed out to different people around there. And I know Herbie came to stay overnight with us, but Hugo, he was going to be sure that the house was okay, so he went back in and fell asleep. Well, my dad was going down to feed the boiler, and he saw that the house was burning again. Hugo was sound asleep, and my dad ran over there and hauled him out of the house by the feet. And I don't know if you might want to turn the tape off for this story, because Hugo, Hugo is also the model for Albright's the wheelwright. So his fame is, I don't know which museum it hangs in.
It's, I think, Pittsburgh. It's either
In the
Pittsburgh.
Carnegie Museum in
Yeah,
Pittsburgh,
I
or
think-
Mellon Museum,
yeah.
whichever. But that's where it is, and it's an excellent one. And I mean,
Mm-hmm.
he's forever immortalized in this picture, as were other men. I mean, the lineman that they printed, they did was Stanford, that lived next door to me. And of course, into the world came a soul named Ida, was Ida Stanford. And it was the most horrible picture you ever wanted to see. And of course, the books are in the museum, you could see this. But this was Mrs.
Except for the
Stanford.
drunkard.
Which, what?
Except for George Stafford, the drunkard.
Oh, well, George was the fisherman. But, George lived across the street from the museum. And the boys had to learn to knit, to paint that shirt that he wears, which is all fine knit. So, I mean, we've got a lot of stories about the Albrights.
Yes.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much. We have learned a great deal, and hopefully we'll be able to use this in many important ways. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
September, when life was slow and oh so mellow. Try to remember the kind of September when grass was green and grain was yellow. Try to remember the kind of September when you were a tender and callow fellow. Try to remember, and if you remember, then follow. Try to remember when life was so tender that dreams were kept upon your pillow. Try to remember when life was so tender that no one wept except the willow. Try to remember when life was so tender that love was an ember about to below. Try to remember, and if you remember, then follow. Deep in December, it's nice to remember, although you know the snow will follow. Deep in December, it's nice to remember, without a hurt, the heart is hollow. Deep in December, it's nice to remember, our hearts should remember and follow.
Good evening. I'm Lauren Olmstein, a born and bred native of Warrenville, and I'd like to offer a special welcome to everyone as we get together this evening to celebrate the history, accomplishments, and future of the city of Warrenville on the occasion of its 175th anniversary.
And I'm Vikita Dempsey, also a lifelong resident of Warrenville. Colonel Warren will be proud of what we have become. When he first staked his claim next to the DuPage River in 1833, he knew then that amazing things were going to take place in this frontier town, although he might be astounded by what this vibrant suburb has become.
By act of the Warrenville City Council, the 175th Anniversary Commission was formed on March 5, 2007. The commission was charged with developing events, items, and programs to honor the 175th anniversary of Warrenville's first settlement in 1833 by Julius Warren. The celebration program you're about to see is just one of the many activities scheduled during this year.
The theme for this year is Remember, Celebrate, Imagine. Our show this evening started off with Try to Remember from the musical The Fantastics, sung by lifelong Warrenville resident, my dad, Tom Sipla.
Education has always been a priority in Warrenville, with the establishment of our schools, both public and private. There are plenty of opportunities locally for